Welcome. Never in recorded history has there been so much widespread disruption all over the world at the same time. Old assumptions are being smashed and new ones are being constantly challenged. To say the world will no longer be the same is a given. But what will the world after Corona look like? To help update our intellectual operating systems and to give us an original framework with which to think about history's biggest stress test, I am privileged to be joined on the India Today e-conclave by one of the greatest chroniclers of our times, the iconic columnist of the New York Times, live on India Today at this moment, Mr. Thomas Friedman. Mr. Friedman, welcome.
Well, welcome to you. Thanks for having me, and greetings to all my friends in India.
It's great to have you with us. You wrote a best-selling book, The World is Flat. If you were updating that book and thinking about what's happening in the world right now, what would the title of your new book be, Mr. Friedman?
The world is flatter than ever, except it just got a little unflat for a while, but it's flatter than ever. And I'll tell you why, Raul. Think of what we're doing right now. I'm sitting in my home in Bethesda, Maryland. You're back in India, and you and I are having a live conversation that people all over India can tune in on. If that isn't the flat world I predicted, then I don't know what is. So in some ways, the world is flatter than ever. But to your important question, post-Corona, in what I call the AC era, after Corona, compared to the BC era, before Corona. In the after Corona era, the world will be less flat around one feature, I think permanently, and that is trade. You know, my argument in the world is flat is that economists don't own the definition of globalization. Globalization isn't just about trade. It's the ability to do what you and I are doing right now. It's the ability of individuals to act globally, and that's what's exploded. But there's no question that after Corona, every country, every major country that can afford to, will be looking to shorten its supply chains around critical medical devices and therapies that it discovered in the coronavirus were part of long supply chains that were vulnerable to this kind of pandemic. That there will be a change on. In the short term, there will also be a change in terms of the globalization of people, the ability of Indians to immigrate or travel to America and Americans to travel to India. That will be slowed down. But if there is a vaccine, I suspect in 2 or 3 years, that will come back. Let's remember, we had a pandemic in 1917, 1918, a global pandemic. There were fewer people on the planet then, but it didn't stop globalization and the march of globalization from coming back once we recovered from it.
Let's spend some time talking about what's happening where you are in the United States. You've written that the world needs leadership that can manage the unavoidable and avoid the unmanageable. When judged against this maxim, the United States seems to have failed badly. How will President Trump's handling of the coronavirus impact America's place in the world, Mr. Friedman?
Well, it's a very important question, one we ask ourselves here every day. You know, I wrote a book in 2011 with my colleague Michael Mandelbaum, warning about this moment. The book was called That Used to Be Us, How America Lost Its Way in the World It Invented and How We Can Come Back. And the theme of the book was addressed to Americans, and the blunt theme was, my fellow Americans, we aren't who we think we are. We think that we can call ourselves exceptional, as if American exceptionalism was like an honorary degree that we got conferred on us, and we could just always point to it on the wall. But exceptionalism is something every country has to earn every day by how it behaves. And I'd warned back in 2011 about this, and this crisis, because pandemics really expose all your strengths and weaknesses. And this crisis really exposed our weaknesses in public health, our weaknesses in our social trust, and most of all, our weaknesses in our cognitive immunity. We've lost our cognitive immunity in America. And what I mean by that is thanks to certain networks here like Fox News, thanks to having a president who describes anything he doesn't like as fake news, our ability as a community and as a public to sort out fact from fiction has really been diminished. We've lost our cognitive immunity. And when you're facing a pandemic from Mother Nature, to not have cognitive immunity, to not even be able to agree on what the facts are, that is so dangerous.
Does the pandemic make it easier for President Trump to get re-elected, or does it make it tougher? Because it's very difficult being a candidate against an incumbent when the whole world is locked down because of the pandemic. Is Trump going to have it easier in November? Does the pandemic make life tougher for him?
Again, a good question, and it all depends on how he performs between now and November and how the pandemic performs. Do we get a vaccine? I could describe for you a scenario where there's somehow a miracle vaccine by September, October. People start to feel really good about economy, and all this stimulus that we've injected into the economy just to keep unemployment from going completely out of control, it starts to kick in, and the economy is like a raging fire in November, raging hot, and that would certainly support Trump. I can give you another scenario, excuse me, where we don't have a vaccine, where we end the lockdowns, we have an okay summer, and the virus comes raging back in the fall. And we continue to have persistent unemployment, and Trump is easily defeated. It all depends on the science of the pandemic and the science of the vaccine.
A lot's being written in the United States about President Trump's best chance of being re-elected being if he's running against China. With the economy in shambles and the pandemic ravaging the country, making the election a referendum on China, would that be possibly one of President Trump's hopes for November?
You know, Raul, if he has to run against China, he's going to lose. Because if he has to run against China, it means he can't run on an America that's recovering from the coronavirus. And if we are not recovering by the fall, economically and in terms of our health, then he'll be running against a lot of people. He'll be running against Nancy Pelosi, Democrats, China, you name it. Anybody he can use to light a fire under his followers.
The president is urging supporters to liberate states run by Democrat governors, encouraging protests against stay-at-home restrictions. When the country is facing this kind of a severe crisis and social distancing is the only way out, how is that likely to play out? It's almost as if he's taking a fire hose and sticking it in as opposed to trying to figure out how to deal with this problem.
Well, if you're following me, you know that I believe that Donald Trump is the worst possible president America could have when facing the worst possible crisis in its history. He is a completely dishonest person. He lies as he breathes. He literally lies as he breathes. And he also wants to be both the arsonist and the firefighter. So on the one hand, he stands up and does his briefings and says, these are the conditions under which states should open up. You know, these 3 phases, all these guidelines set by our best epidemic experts. And on the other hand, he goes back to the Oval Office and tweets to his followers to liberate your states and pay no attention to the directives I just outlined to the country. He is a complete ignoramus when it comes to science. He is an utterly dishonest and unscrupulous person, and he is the worst possible man to have as president of the United States right now. We are cursed by having him as our president.
How will this virus impact China's quest for global domination? China is trying to help countries in Europe and Africa by providing them medical equipment. It's also being blamed for hiding facts and lying about what the Communist Party knew about the virus. Will this strengthen China's march towards global domination?
Well, you know, China cannot supplant America in terms of global leadership by passing out masks to people, many of which turned out to be defective. China can only lead if it unmasks the truth about where the coronavirus came from. Did it accidentally leak from a laboratory in Wuhan, or did it most likely come out of a wet market in China, where China continues to practice something that it should have banned after SARS in 2003, and that is the sale of wildlife in markets along with domesticated beef, where you create the ample opportunity for zoonotic diseases to jump from this wildlife that acquired and co-developed with these viruses in the wild are then ingested by human beings. It's a terrible practice. China owes the world an explanation, and it cannot mask that by giving the world masks. It's going to owe the world an explanation. It has not given that explanation, and I urge it to, because we do need China as a collaborator to get the world back on its feet. But I'm not for one, and I think many Americans, and here I agree with President Trump, they owe us some answers, they owe the world some answers, and they owe us some assurances that all these zoonotic diseases which have been coming out of China, like SARS and now COVID-19, are going to stop because their practices are going to stop.
That's the challenge at this moment. But when time looks back at this moment, will history remember the pandemic as that point in history when the US ceded global leadership to China?
You know, I just don't know. I think if we use this crisis to actually begin investing in our resilience and productivity again, use it to extend rural broadband all across America, use it to go massively into green technologies, because after all, this pandemic is just the warm-up for climate change. Use it to massively expand 3D manufacturing and bring manufacturing to America. If we use this crisis in a smart way, America can come out of it stronger. If we don't use this crisis in a smart way, China could become the world leader by default, but I think China has plenty of challenges as well. So all I can say is if you didn't like a strong America in the world, I promise you, you won't like it to a weak America.
Sitting where you are, what's your sense of how India is doing? You've been to our country many times, you've traveled extensively. What's your sense in a global context? How is India doing against this pandemic?
Well, I think the challenge, obviously, of a country like India is that its ability to economically to sustain long-term lockdown, to break the transmission of the virus, is hugely challenging. When people are asked to return to their village and wash their hands, you know, multiple times a day, that's a challenge for some of India's, most underprivileged and poorest people. When they're told if you feel ill, go to a doctor. Well, if there is one doctor for every 10,000 plus people in rural India, that's a challenge. And when they're told to social distance, when so many people don't have another room to go into to social distance, that's a huge challenge. So it seems to me that India probably has no choice but to go for herd immunity, and that is to shelter and protect its most elderly and let its young, those are immune and those who will experience the virus in its mild or asymptomatic form to go out and back to work. It seems to me President Modi has done a good job initially in basically trying to break the chains of transmission. We'll just have to see. The trick here is to get your people out to acquire immunity naturally, but only get those out who can do so and experience the COVID-19 virus asymptomatically or mildly, so you don't overwhelm your healthcare system.
When you look at the leadership style that's on display in the United States, compare that with the manner in which Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been firm and decisive in the directions that he's issued to the public, and look at what President Bolsonaro and President Xi is doing in China. How do you compare the different leadership styles of the various statespeople all across the world?
Well, let me put it this way, or from 30,000 feet, that this is a very different crisis for every leader. And that is because the enemy here is not another country. It's not China facing off against India or India against China, or America against the Soviet Union, or vice versa. When you are fighting a war against another member of the human species, you can use the terms win and lose, okay? America was able to win World War II by out-mobilizing and out-manufacturing the Nazi Germans and the Japanese. America was able to win the Cold War by out-innovating and outspending the Soviet Union. But Mother Nature as a foe is different. You can't win against Mother Nature because she's just chemistry, biology, and physics. That's all she is. She's going to do whatever chemistry, biology, and physics dictate, and she always bats last, and she always bats 1,000. So when you're up against Mother Nature, your goal is not to defeat her. Your goal is to adapt to her. In the natural world, Mother Nature rewards not the strongest, not the smartest. She awards the most adaptive, those who are able to evolve their chemistry, biology, and physics to adapt when she changes the climate or she changes the circumstances of your existence. That's what evolution is all about. So what every country faces today is a huge adaptation challenge. And what I'm watching around the world is the different ways that different countries are choosing to adapt. Sweden, for instance, has chosen to go straight for herd immunity. Other countries are using combinations of lockdowns and phased openings. It's too early to say who has got it right.
You know, you write about Mother Nature and then you write about father greed. Do you think in some senses it's human greed which led to the kind of responses we saw initially, especially in the United States, and that's why America is having to pay the price that it is right now?
Well, the way I put it is this way, you know, President Trump is someone who has no feel for or experience of the natural world. He measures everything in money and market terms. And so early on in this crisis, when he would do something and the stock market would go up, he would use that as confirmation that what he was doing was right. Unfortunately, because he doesn't understand Mother Nature, while Trump was admiring the market, Mother Nature was silently, invisibly, inexorably, exponentially, and mercilessly spreading the coronavirus around our whole country. And Mother Nature, unlike the market, does not start her day at 9:30 in the morning. She does not close at 4, and she does not take weekends off. And so Trump, because he has no feel for the market, had no feel for what was actually going on under his feet.
You write extensively on globalization. You've written about the 3 phases of globalization so far. Globalization 1.0, which is led by countries and governments as the main protagonists. Globalization 2.0, which is about multinational companies driving global integration. Then globalization 3.0, which is convergence through optic microcables and the rise of workflow software. Mr. Friedman, will the post-corona era herald globalization 4.0? And what will the new globalization project look like?
Well, I think it'll look for sure a lot like what you and I are doing right now. You know, what a thrill this is. I'm able to talk to thousands of friends in India. And I'm sitting in my home in Bethesda. Is this as good as me coming to India and being able to look my friends in the eye, share a meal with them? No, it's not as good. But it's about 80% as good. And it's 100% less stress on me. And so I've been having these kind of conversations. I'm having one with the UN this afternoon, and then I'm participating in a conference in China this evening, all in one day, all sitting in my office in Bethesda. And this technology is only going to get better and stronger and easier and cheaper. And so this kind of globalization is clearly going to be a bigger part of our future after Corona. What will happen to the other parts will depend on how quickly we get a vaccine.
So are you saying that next time the India Day group invites you to one of our conclaves in Delhi or Mumbai, you're just going to say, hey, beam me in, I'll come via broadband?
Exactly. You know, I mean, you have to admit that's sort of what I said when you called this time. Because it's so easy for me to do and so beneficial. I'm able to communicate with so many people around the world. And again, it's not like being there, and I'll never give that up. But under the circumstances, it's pretty darn good.
We're seeing 2 kinds of responses globally in your articles and writings. One is from loose cultures, the other what you describe as tight cultures like China and some other countries in Asia. Which culture or which cultural response do you believe is likely to come up on top when it comes to fighting this virus, Mr. Friedman?
Well, Raul, this concept of tight and loose cultures was coined by a friend of mine, Professor Michelle Gelfand at the University of Maryland. So tight cultures are very top-down, authority-bound, rule-driven, very orderly. Loose cultures are very individualistic, not particularly responsive to authority, more bottom-up and side-to-side than top-down. And clearly, early on, the tight cultures seem to be dealing with this crisis better than the loose cultures. Singapore, Hong Kong, China, South Korea, Germany, as opposed to the loose cultures of Spain, America, and Italy, who have had many more deaths. So in the near term, which is all we can say, is in a pandemic, tight cultures seem to have an advantage over loose cultures, at least in the first phase.
Does it also, in some senses, condition that country and its responses? Because if tight cultures have the advantage, then countries like Italy, countries like India, countries like Spain then have that problem, because that's just the way their countries are organized. Do you believe one of the longer term consequences could be moving from a loose culture to what you're calling a tight culture, or at least a tighter culture than where some of these countries would have been?
Well, I can't speak for India, but I can speak for America, and that I would say it this way, Ro. If we want to retain our loose culture, then we need to invest in much more resiliency in case this kind of event happens. We should be investing in national health care. We should be investing in our environment and our sustainability. We should be investing in our cognitive immunity. We need to really invest in our resilience if we want to maintain our loose culture, because the cost of being a loose culture could be generational. In terms of the cost we pay otherwise.
The state just at this moment has exerted a lot more power than citizens would ordinarily allow. Do you think this will be a temporary phase? Or are you concerned that some of the new extra powers that governments across the world are exerting could become a feature of our lives going forward?
Well, I think it could. One of the reasons, Raul, I've called for a national unity government. I've called for Senate Vice President Biden, if he does win the presidency, to actually create a national unity government with moderate Republicans. Because I think some of the issues that we're going to have to deal with after Corona are going to be so wrenching. One is, you've alluded to it, is civil liberties. After 9/11, I wanted to be sure that the person sitting next to me on an airplane was not carrying a bomb. Well, after Corona, I want to be sure that that person is not carrying a virus. And the only way to do that is going to be with intrusive tracking, tracing, testing, and labeling. And a lot of Americans are going to resist that, okay? And so I think you need a national unity government to kind of get that through. At the same time, there's going to be huge equity issues here after Corona. Who got bailed out and who didn't? Why did my neighborhood Indian restaurant have to close after 20 years of being good citizens, while some company that managed their balance sheet very poorly got bailed out? There's going to be a huge equity debate in America after this. And that equity debate and that civil liberties debate are going to be wrenching. And we're going to want a national unity government to manage that.
Finances globally are limited. How do you answer the question that you just raised? What do we save? What should we let go under? Because every sector in India, as is the case globally, is asking for bailouts, financial stimulus. Money is very limited. How should governments be spending that money, in your view?
Well, in the short term, they just have to spend it, borrow it and spend it. And thankfully, global interest rates are so low. I mean, they're almost zero, which means the government actually can borrow the money and give it to someone in India and have to pay back so little interest that it's almost free. So we should be doing that. We're doing the right thing in America, and in India, if that's what's going on, doing that as well. But I suspect there are going to be multiple bailouts here, and some of them can't just be bailouts. I hope they will be actual stimulus, where we are looking to stimulate the economy and by thinking about, as we did in the Depression, how do we stimulate the economy so when we come out of this, we'll be actually more productive. We'll have more broadband internet, more high-speed rail, more green technologies, more knowledge workers. That's how we should be thinking about how we stimulate the economy.
You know, you're exceptional at joining the dots. If you look at all the dots that are floating in the world at this moment, and if you were to start piecing them together, what would the new economic order look like going forward in your view, Mr. Friedman?
Bro, it's too hard to tell. I just, I'm taking it day by day. It's hard for me to know where this story is going to go next week, let alone afterwards. All I know is for sure, when we look back at who did well and who didn't, two things will stand out. Those who did well were rigorously science-based and followed what the science said, not what ideology or short-term political calculation said. And the people who do well will be the countries that have good government. By the way, whatever their formal system of government is, autocracy, democracy, emirate, kingdom, quasi-democracy, that what will stand out is whatever system you had, how well did you govern?
And is there anything that you think that's being done right now by governments that can determine that? One, of course, is whether they're listening to science, but anything else that you believe in terms of how they're communicating, in terms of how they're acting, which would determine that when the tide goes out, who's naked and who's not?
Well, what I do believe is that I'm now speaking as an American. Historically, America played three roles when a global crisis, mostly a world war, but even a depression, came along. One is that we led the efforts for a coordinated response. We helped the world organize in the face of this crisis. Second, we gave aid and comfort to other people in the crisis because we were a rich and generous country. And third, we were rigorously science and fact-based. And unfortunately, Raul, in this crisis, we have been none of those things. We have not been a leader. We have not been rigorously scientific in our approach. And we have not been providing aid and comfort to the rest of the world. And that, for me, is very disturbing.
Is that impacting how Americans are perceiving themselves internally within your country? Is this because the world has seen America's leadership over the past several decades, and this is one crisis where America is bumbling, and in a country like India, we're quite astounded by the fact that India has handled this crisis so much better than the United States. And when the crisis would have hit, if you'd asked people, where is the situation likely to spiral out of control and who's likely to have things reasonably under control, the answer would have been on the opposite side of reality right now.
Well, Raul, I'll only say to you what I'm saying to my fellow Americans. We aren't who we think we are. We've spent the last 20 years acting as if we can be dumb as we want to be. Dumb as we want to be. We don't have to believe in climate change. We don't have to invest in resilience. We don't have to believe in science. We can just be ideological. We can elect a complete huckster named Donald Trump and make him president of the United States and assume that in a crisis he will perform any better than a used car salesman, and actually suggest to people they have they ingest detergent as a way of cleaning out their bodies. So if we as a country behave with such reckless disregard for our governing systems that have made us great and the people you need and want to run those systems, then we get what we deserve. And this has been a huge wake-up call. We are not who we think we are.
But has America, or have Americans learned their lesson? Not just those who in any case would have voted Democrat, but net, do Americans in your view realize they made a huge mistake or not really?
Well, some of them do. Some of them can't admit that. They're too deep in with Trump. We'll only know in November, on November 3rd, how many have drawn the right conclusion. America needs a conservative party. We need a healthy conservative party. Every liberal democracy should have someone bringing, more market-based approaches to solving problems. We need a healthy conservative party. We do not have a healthy conservative party today. We have something called the Republican Party, and it is a deformed beast that is today, I think, the biggest threat to our country's health.
Will this pandemic make people in America and across the world more sensitive towards moving fast on nature's next curveball, climate change? You think a lot and very deeply about climate change. What is the next crisis that you're anticipating, and how should we prepare for that?
Well, this is, in fact, the warm-up for climate change, but there are two differences between a pandemic and climate change. One is that climate change doesn't peak, bro. It doesn't peak and then go away. If we let the Greenland ice shelf melt, if we let the Antarctic melt, ice shelf, these poles will not reflect the sun's rays. The sun's rays will go into the oceans will rise, and we will basically boil the ocean and produce crazy, destructive weather as a result. So climate change doesn't peak. And the other difference between climate change and a pandemic is that you cannot get herd immunity to climate change. All you get is an endless pounding on the herd. So we desperately don't want to go there. We need to come out of this crisis and realize if we don't want to be visited by this thing again, we need to avoid what is now unmanageable and avoid what would be absolutely. We need to manage what is now avoidable. Sorry, we need to manage what is now unavoidable and avoid what would be truly unmanageable, which is endless destructive weather because of climate change.
You wrote about mosquitoes traveling much further than they would have because of climate change. What's the nature of the next climate change crisis, or the next crisis that you think the world could be dealing with? You're speaking to so many experts in the United States and elsewhere. What's the kind of worst case scenario they could be presenting to you?
Well, we've gotten out of balance with nature. That's why we are threatened by climate change, and that's why we got this crisis. We got this crisis because we have kept, through deforestation, climate change, and unbridled urbanization and development, we have invaded ecosystems and destroyed them all over the world, from the Amazon to America to India to China, to Japan, all across the world. And what we've done in these ecosystems is that we've killed the apex predators, and we have killed the iconic species, sometimes because we wanted their rhino horns or their elephant tusks or their tiger, fur or whatever. And once you kill the apex predators in these ecosystems, all you're left with are the generalized species who then have no predators, and they proliferate. They're called rats, they're called bats, and they're called primates, different kinds of monkeys, basically. And these rats, bats, and primates basically have co-evolved with these viruses in the wild. Well, when they proliferate, come closer to humans, and then we hunt them and sell them in wet markets in Wuhan next to domesticated beef, what happens? What happens is these viruses that actually co-evolved in the wilderness, were never meant for human exposure, jump to humans, and you end up with a global pandemic. SARS happened that way, and COVID-19 happened that way.
This crisis has seen a lot of intrusion into citizen privacy. There's big tech being used, especially in countries like China, South Korea, very successfully, where big data, social media was used to trace infections, alert people about hotspots, and round up all contacts. Do you think this is here to stay? This is a debate between health and privacy. Right now, health is winning. Is that the way it will stay? Will Big Brother now have deeper surveillance than they've ever had in the past?
I think it's inevitable if you want to overcome this crisis without a vaccine. Without a vaccine, all you have is tracking, tracing, testing, tracking, tracing, and sequestering. That's the only way you can keep the virus down. And until there's a vaccine, you're going to have these much more intrusive on civil liberties technologies. Some cultures and societies may resist that. America may be one of them. India may be one of them. China, clearly not. We'll see if that gives China an advantage in the long run. Even that's not clear.
What's your best sense of when this nightmare will finally be over by, and when life starts returning to normal? For people who are watching, what do you think, sir, the new normal could look like?
Well, I think that we're in a race right now, Raul, between Moore's Law and COVID's Law. So COVID's law says that, one person who acquires this virus will give it to about 2.5 other people, close to 3. And when you do that 10,000 times, 10 times, where 1 gives it to 3, 3 gives it to 3, and et cetera, you end up with the number 59,000 very quickly. So that's an exponential. Moore's law is the exponential for technology. The speed and power of microchips will double every 24 months. It's a proxy for accelerating technological progress. And we're in a race now between Moore's law and COVID's law. Can all this compute power we've now assembled, all this knowledge, come up with a vaccine faster than COVID's law, the coronavirus, will exponentially spread and overwhelm your healthcare system? That's the race we're in. I have a lot of faith in Moore's law. You read in the paper every day the number of people searching for a vaccine, and some have even tested prototypes that seem to work in primates and different kinds of, monkeys, apes, and gorillas alike. And so we'll just have to see. I'm more hopeful than not.
There's certain questions you raised, and I want you to answer those as best as you can, because a vaccine could be a year away, maybe a year and a half, at worst maybe 2 years away. So when people get on crowded buses, do they go to work or not? If they're on a subway and the person next to them is not wearing gloves and masks, what do? What happens if someone sneezes? If you get into an elevator in the office and the other person is in it, do you step out? Do you stay in? Do you sit in an office lunchroom which is crowded or not? If you go to a drink at a bar and the stools are stacked next to each other, do you hang there? Do you leave? How do you think people will wrap their heads around questions like these?
Well, I think ultimately the way they will do it, if you look at America right now, really, is that old people like me, I'm 66 years old, are not going to any bars. I'm not going to any football games. I'm staying home. I do not want to meet this virus anywhere. Younger people who may already have had it and been asymptomatic or experienced it mildly and are immune should go back to work. And hopefully develop herd immunity for us, so the old people like me can come out safely. That's the model I think we're tending toward everywhere. Let the young, the healthy who will experience COVID-19 as just a mild flu or even a tough flu but not require hospitalization, and let those who have already experienced it, and we believe, and this has not been confirmed, but certainly the predominance of opinion among experts is we believe it will provide you immunity, at least for a period of time, should go back to work and get your economy going.
And in the midst of all of this, President Trump is virtually asking Americans to go out and play Russian roulette. How dangerous do you think that is, and do you think that could lead to a big spike, and why?
Yes, it can, because what Trump has been doing in an undifferentiated way, when he says liberate your state, he's not saying old people stay home. He's not telling young people stay away from your grandparents, don't visit them in a nursing home. He's just making a generalized political point to rile up his base. And if we do that, as Tennessee, the state of Tennessee seems to be doing it, certainly a lot of experts believe that the virus will come back, and it'll come roaring back.
What do you think will be the future, sir, of the World Health Organization? The United Nations Security Council hardly had any role to play. These multilateral organizations were at the center of the world order for a long time. Now, the whole world seems to be disrupted. The WHO is under attack. The UN nowhere in the picture. How do you think this will pan out in the future?
Well, the WHO did not behave well here. It was slow to declare this a pandemic. It was too willing to play down China's role in the emergence of this virus. And in the last few days, it's done something bizarre, which was to release a statement saying it's not clear that if you get this virus and acquire immunity, that will make you immune from getting it again in the near future. Then a day later, it took that tweet down and said, we're not saying that if you get this virus, you can't be immune. I found that a bizarre statement, because if what you're telling me is that nature's way of creating herd immunity, that I get exposed to a disease and I develop the antibodies against it and therefore can't acquire it again, if you're telling me that doesn't work with COVID-19, then what the hell are we doing looking for a virus? We're looking for a vaccine. A vaccine is based on giving you a small dose of the virus and building up that immunity naturally. So if we can't do it naturally without a vaccine, what the hell are we doing even looking for a vaccine? So what kind of statement was that even to make for the WHO? Especially when a lot of experts believe that you do acquire immune antibodies, and that 2 tests that China has done on primates in China, injecting them with COVID-19 and the antibodies, found that it worked. So I don't know what in the world the WHO was doing, but what they did, I think, was very destructive.
You know, towards the end of this interview, I want to ask you on a personal note, how has this lockdown been for you? You would probably never spend so much. You're a globetrotter, jet setter all over the world with your suitcase. You've been locked up, as is the rest of the world, for very long. How's this been for you on the personal side?
Well, I'm a globetrotter. I'm not really a jet setter, though. I miss being able to pick up and go see my friends in India and other countries, feeling, touching these places on the ground. But at the same time, I've been locked up almost for 2 months now here in Bethesda, Maryland. And it's given me a kind of enforced pause to rest my body from 40 years of travel and jet lag. And that's actually been healthy and good for me. But I wouldn't want to do it much longer, although I may have to.
Thank you so much, Mr. Friedman, for joining us and sharing your thoughts. There's always so much interesting ideas flowing straight out of what you're saying. Deeply appreciate you taking our time and joining us on this India Today e-conclave. Thomas Friedman, iconic columnist.
Thank you, and thanks to all my friends at India Today, and thanks to all my friends in India, and stay safe and healthy, all of you.
And we do hope that when this crisis is over, you will make another trip to India and join us in person. It's been great to talk to you virtually in this e-conclave, but we'd love to have you over in person as well. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
That was Thomas Friedman in the concluding session of the India Today e-conclave. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. We'll have more for you on the other side. Stay with us. We're back with more.